outside pocket.
Okay.
Is your tie okay?
My tie is great.
Okay, you can just sit it on that side.
Okay.
Well, actually, on this side.
All right. Sorry.
I'll get you a piece of tape in a second.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks. Here we have the national correspondent for the China Daily. Gets a lot of plays here. Kamita, U.S.-China Business Council.
Excuse me, sir. You can put this on the inside of your coat jacket. On this side.
This side. Okay.
Ah, we have a pro here.
Washington Insider.
Let me make an adjustment.
Okay.
On this side. And if you can slide this on the inside of the
Mhm.
pocket there. Hey, Robert. 3 minutes before you start.
Yeah. Things that I have a hard time with at these meetings is ever since cell phones, all the clocks have come off the walls in institutions all over America, universities. You know, my eye still wants to look up and see a clock, and they're not in classrooms, they're not in conference rooms, they've come off the walls. Very rarely see a clock.
You're right. A big part of the problem is keeping them correctly timed.
Right.
You know, with the change, the twice annual change.
Which I think we should be ready to retire now.
And then, you know, there are a few of us old timers who actually have these things strapped to our wrists.
Thanks.
A lot of kids nowadays have never owned a watch.
That's an interesting note-taking thing.
This is
More
called
linear, more.
This is called not having a printer.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the Wilson Center, all of you who are here with us here in the auditorium, and those who are watching on C-SPAN or subsequently on our webcast. The Wilson Center, for those of you who have not been here before, is the living memorial to the 28th President of the United States. My name is Robert Daly. I direct the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States here at the Wilson Center. We're very glad to be able to bring you this program on corruption, constitutionalism, and control, implications of the Fourth Plenum for China and U.S.-China relations. And this afternoon's talk brings together two topics which are very often treated separately, although I think they belong in the same program, which are corruption and China's attempts to carry out a further round of legal reforms. No doubt all of you have been following corruption stories from China over the past few years, and you have heard about Xi Jinping's willingness to take on both tigers and flies. You've probably followed the sometimes sordid tales of Bo Xilai, Zhou Yongkang, and Xu Caiho. Xi Jinping's attempt to combat corruption is often in the American media characterized as a campaign, but it really seems to be a state of affairs. It's part of Xi's ongoing governance rather than a campaign in the usual sense. And combating corruption has been one of the major factors leading to Xi Jinping's great popularity in China. As evidence of this popularity, you need look no further than the second line of the new viral song in China called Xi Da Da Loves Peng Mama. I don't know if you've heard this or not. It's covered in today's New York Times. If you haven't seen it, I urge you to give it a close listen. The first two lines, China has produced an Uncle Xi, 中国出了个 Xi Da Da. He dares to fight the tigers. 多大的老虎也敢打. So notice too that in this song, it's actually very catchy. It's like a lot of Chinese songs that has elements of march and elements of folk tune. It's hard to get out of your head. And that line, 中国出了个 Xi Da Da, China has produced an Uncle Xi, harkens directly back to the East is Red. which begins, 东方红, the east is red, 太阳升, the sun has come up, 中国出了个毛泽东, China has produced a Mao Zedong. So there's a link to Mao in this popular song about how ardently she and his wife love each other. So she has been very closely associated with anti-corruption, the China dream, continued economic and social reform. This all seems to be of a piece for his governance and indeed for China. It is sometimes difficult for us from the United States to discern how these different pieces fit together, and therefore it can be tough to figure out how we need to respond to a rapidly changing China. And the difficulty comes even at the linguistic level if you've tried to wrestle in either Chinese or English with some of the recent documents about legal reform in China. And they're full of socialism with Chinese characteristics and continued reform. Then different uses of phrases that seem to have something to do with law, but it's clearly a legal concept not quite like our own. Even the phrase 腐败, corrupt. Who is corrupt and who is not? One of the questions we'll be asking, I hope today, is whether the anti-corruption efforts of Xi's government are primarily principled or primarily political. What does corruption mean? The documents that were released after the plenum, the big meeting of the Communist Party in October, I think offer some clues as to where Xi intends to take these themes, to take these efforts to improve governance. This was the first plenum to focus on law or on governing in accordance with law. I was struck in reading American breakdowns of this plenum, as it was case 2 last year with the third plenum. Many writers focused on what wasn't in these documents. Usually from an American point of view, these documents were criticized for the things that Americans wished would be in these documents that weren't there. And often we didn't focus on the many proposals for change that were in these documents. And I think that we need to begin from a Chinese point of view. The Kissinger Institute is committed to beginning an analysis of China with how China sees itself. We may not end there, but that has to be part of our analysis. And the documents coming out of this plenum were very frank about the depth and breadth of problems that China faces in its legal system. It had an almost confessional quality to it, and it seemed to raise expectations extremely high. So to understand these, the values, the priorities, the policies of Xi Jinping, I said we want to start where China started, with corruption and with legal questions. And to do that, I think we could have no better pair of scholars than Andrew Wiedemann and Donald Clark. Andrew Wiedemann is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Georgia State University and is, I think, the United States now leading expert on Chinese corruption questions within the context of political economy. He's been working on this since long before Xi Jinping began his anti-corruption efforts, about 15 years. That's been a major research focus, Andy?
Pushing 18.
18 years. Before he came to Georgia State, he was at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he directed the Asian Studies program and the International Studies program. And he has also been a visiting research professor at Beijing University. I had the pleasure of working with Andy when he was a visiting professor of political science at the Johns Hopkins University, Nanjing University Center for Chinese and American Studies, where he was from 2006 to 2008. And I would also like to welcome actually his daughter Maggie, who was also at the Hopkins Nanjing Center and is now studying China with David Shambaugh at George Washington. Andy is now working on a new book project that examines social unrest in China, and he is the author previously of From Mao to Market, Rent-Seeking, Local Protectionism, and Marketization in China, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2003, and The Double Paradox of Rapid Growth and Rising Corruption in China, brought out by the Cornell University Press in 2012. I should also mention that when we were at the Hopkins Nanjing Center together, Andy once caught me singing loudly the Rolling Stones' Wild Horses in what I thought was the abandoned underground garage, where the acoustics were excellent, but I was not alone. And in that small community, you did me the courtesy, to the best of my knowledge, of never telling anybody. So a man of discretion, as well as a man of letters. I want to thank you for that. Donald Clark is the David Weaver Research Professor of Law at George Washington University, where he has been since 2005, and a leading specialist in Chinese law. He was previously at the University of Washington School of Law in Seattle and at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Before that, he practiced law for 3 years at a major international firm that had a large Chinese practice, and he is fluent very fluent in Mandarin Chinese. He's published in the China Quarterly and the American Journal of Comparative Law, among other major journals, on subjects ranging from Chinese criminal law and procedure to corporate governance. His recent research is focused on Chinese legal institutions and legal issues as they relate to China's economic reforms. These are exactly the topics of the third and fourth plenum. He was also founded and maintains China Law, which is the leading listserv on Chinese law on the internet. And he writes the Chinese Law Prof blog, which I have bookmarked and is one of the first places I go whenever there's a major legal issue to get a good explanation of what's going on in China. He is a member of the New York Bar and the Council on Foreign Relations. So we'll start for about 15 minutes each. First Andy and then Don. Then we may have a little time for them to ask each other questions, and then we look forward to hearing from all of you. We'll open it up. So thank you once again, and Andy, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. I did not ever share your singing in the basement, but now that the cat is out of the bag, I no longer feel obligated to be discreet. Welcome to all of you and to the viewers of C-SPAN. Let me begin with the question that Robert raised in his opening remarks, and it's one that I think I get frequently about Xi Jinping's now 2-year-old anti-corruption campaign. Is it principled or is it political? I think if you look at the way the most visible part of the campaign has unfolded, it's easy to say that this is nothing but pure power politics. You know, the campaign really predates Xi Jinping. It begins in November of 2011 when an English businessman turns up dead in a Chongqing hotel, is swiftly cremated, and looks like he will be simply forgotten. And then later in 2012, the former head of public security in Chongqing attempts to defect to the United States, in the wake of which we discovered that Gu Kailai, the wife of Chongqing Party Secretary Bo Xilai, is allegedly behind the murder. Bo Xilai and Xi have apparently been collecting money from a variety of sources. The English businessman may well have been laundering the money for him. From Bo Xilai, we moved to former Politburo Standing Committee member, former head of the internal security apparatus, Zhou Yongkang. From Zhou Yongkang, we move on to a series of what I would think of as kind of clusters of corruption cases. We have Jiang Zemin, the former head of the Chinese National Petroleum Company. We get a whole nest of corruption cases in the oil sector. We then have a series of corruption scandals involving Zhou Yongkang's former secretaries, people who had worked with him in Sichuan particularly, linked into whole networks of corrupt businessmen. We get evidence then that some of his former underlings in the Ministry of Public Security have been involved in, among other things, money laundering in Macau, but also arranging dates for senior members of the leadership with the staff of Chinese Central TV. Finally, we get his son is implicated in a series of schemes, most of which involve flipping of state assets. The son would get a hold of them on behalf of other businessmen and then resell them. And among those that he was connected to was a man named Liu Han, who is a major figure, according to the government, in Chinese organized crime. If you look at that series, and then we get several more interesting scandals. We get what's known as the Shanxi earthquake, in which a whole host of people in the province of Shanxi, most of them in some way involved in the coal sector, are implicated in a series of nefarious deals, which in part linked to a man named Ling Zhongsi, whose brother happened to be Hu Jintao's right-hand man, and whose nephew plowed a $300,000 Porsche into a Beijing bridge abutment at 4 o'clock in the morning with 2 scantily clad co-eds. So if you look at that, and then most recently, of course, we have the military scandal. A series of generals are caught trading basically promotions for jobs. Most recently, General Su Sai-he his house was searched. They found literally a metric ton of cash. It took between 10 and 15 military trucks to take all the, quote, evidence / loot out of his apartment, out of his 20,000 square foot house. You look at these scandals, and the easy conclusion is that this is about politics. That Xi Jinping comes in, and that basically what you look at is, for various random reasons, Bo Xilai sets himself up. Bo Xilai becomes an entryway, and Bo had been something of a rival, or had been portrayed as something of a rival of Xi Jinping. It's an opening that allows Xi Jinping to go after Zhou Yongkang, to go after a wide swath of people at a fairly senior level, and to clear them out and obviously replace them with his own people. At the same time, you can look at it as a very clear effort by Xi Jinping to consolidate his own power by going after the big tigers, after the Zhou Yongkangs, after the Bo Xilais, and showing that he is willing to take on anybody, regardless of how high up they might be, how sensitive the case may be. He is trying to demonstrate his bona fides. And so when you look at it on that level, you do say, well, is this principled or political? And I think the easy conclusion is to say, looking at that level, it's political. But I think you have to broaden out and look at the bigger picture. The number of big tigers that is taken out is a little bit vague. Exactly what constitutes a big tiger in terms of rank, in terms of importance, I think is partly in the eyes of the beholder. And so the numbers vary depending on who you're listening to, between about 6 and maybe 120, 130. Whether it's 60 or whether it's 130, I don't think is actually as important as might appear on the surface. When you broaden out and look at the bigger picture, this campaign formally began 2 years ago, in November of 2012. The numbers are incomplete, and unfortunately, the Chinese only give us numbers in year increments, not in months. So we don't know how many people got taken out during the first 2 months of 2012. We don't know how many people will be taken out this year because the year isn't over, and you get part-year statistics, which, having looked at these for, as I think I told Robert, 18 years, I know the part-year statistics often are largely meaningless. That you really have to have the kind of constant metric. So the best figures we have are for 2013. In 2013, the procuratorate, which is the judicial branch which has the power to indict an individual and to bring that individual to court for trial. The procuratorate, in the Chinese terminology, they filed the case. It's basically to hand down an indictment. They indicted 37,551 people. So if the number of big tigers was 60 or 130, it's a tiny fraction of the total number of people indicted. That number, 37,551, was up almost 9% over the previous year. Now, 9% may not sound like a tidal wave of anti-corruption. But if you go back and you look at the number of people indicted, the number has gradually declined from over 40,000 down to a trough of 32,000 in 2011. It was up a little bit in 2012, but up 9% in 2013. The number may well be up on something on the same order this year. It's hard to tell because you don't really have any partial statistics. They also give us some numbers for people higher up the food chain. For people who are holding leadership positions at the county and the departmental level, they indicted 2,871. That was up 12% from 2012. More significantly, at the prefecture and the bureau level, the number jumped from 188 to 261, a 39% increase. So when you look at when you look at the top, and if you follow the campaign in the media, the media campaign or the media focus is totally on the big tigers. And the big tigers are important, but the bulk of the campaign is at the next level down. It's not so much against the flies, against the people who are the fairly low-level officials, etc. It's at this leadership, upper leadership level where you get this huge, almost 40% increase. To me, what that suggests is that the answer to Robert's question, is it principled or is it political, is, quite frankly, yes. It's both. Xi Jinping is trying to do two things at once. He's trying to consolidate his power. He's trying to go out and take out big tigers. And at the same time, he is, as best I can interpret it, he is really serious about wanting to fight corruption. I think there's a realization, and this comes out as I'll talk about in a minute when we look at what this campaign has revealed. Corruption has gotten considerably worse over the past decade. When I wrote the book, the Double Paradox book, back working on it really in 2008, 2009, I looked at all the data and I couldn't see any real evidence of a worsening, deepening, or intensification of corruption. When I look at this campaign and I look at what's come out, corruption is worse than I actually had thought. You know, you can look at people like General Gu Zhanshan. This was a man who was in charge of logistics, base construction, and other things for the PLA. The man was apparently flipping real estate and collecting 2%. One deal allegedly involved billions of yuan in fees for Shanghai real estate. When they raided his house, he literally had a tunnel full of expensive Maotai liquor and a 3-foot-tall golden statue of Mao, plus considerable cash. As I said earlier, when they raided Su Shaiho's home, they found a metric ton of cash. These are unprecedented figures, and in some ways they're quite interesting. Why would you sit on a metric ton of cash? And the answer is probably interesting. He didn't have anything to do with it. He couldn't get it out of the country. He apparently couldn't get it out of the country, and he really couldn't spend it. So he sits there, and they accumulate this cash. So you look at the scale of the corruption that's being revealed in this campaign, and it's not millions of renminbi. It's tens of millions and even hundreds of millions, which is, these are sums that I think we have not really encountered in the past. But what also struck me is this. Those two cases are real tigers. I mean, these are senior generals. But there was a man named Ma Chao-chun who was arrested in Qinghuangdao in Hebei province recently. The man ran a local water company. Not exactly what I would consider a high-powered position. When they raided his home, they found 80 million renminbi in cash, $425,000 US, plus 37 kilos of gold and certificates for 68 properties. So not only do we have evidence of this kind of huge sums of money on the part of the tigers, but we have some extraordinarily fat flies down at the bottom. If a man whose basic job is to provide you with water and sewage can collect I would have to quickly do my math and multiply by 6 and add 100 million renminbi. If you can extract 100 renminbi for tap water, that's quite a fly. We go on, early on we had all these cases. We had Sister House, she had 45 properties. We had Brother House, 19 properties. And these are low-level officials. So when you look at what the campaign has revealed, it's not just a problem of big tigers gorging themselves on the economy. The flies are also sucking a great deal of blood out of the economy. What are the prospects looking at all this? Yeah, Xi Jinping has racked up a pretty good hunting record. He's got some pretty impressive pelts. I think, as Robert said, his campaign is popular. Do I expect a sea change in corruption? Do I expect to have to be looking for a new topic after nearly 2 decades of slogging through endless stories on corruption? Absolutely not. You know, what Xi Jinping at best is going to do is he's going to lay down some suppressing fire. He's going to get people ducking. He's going to get people to be careful. They're going to take that 50 million that they have stashed in their basement and they're going to hide it really good. You know, everything I've heard out of China recently, people are petrified, they're worried, you know, there's a lot of fear and anxiety. How long that lasts is hard to tell. You know, this campaign is 2 years old. For 2 years, I keep expecting it to begin to wind down. And for 2 years, I've been wrong one time after another. Some have suggested that this campaign is now the new normal, and that in fact, this campaign will just keep going on and on and on. If it does, that may have positive effects because the pressure will be kept up, officials will have to be careful, and therefore they'll avoid they'll avoid accepting bribes or do it with a great deal of cunning. The other danger is after a while, when the inspectors don't arrive and when you get away with it, you become emboldened. So I don't expect to see dramatic inroads into corruption. I don't expect it to go away anytime soon. But having said that, I think it's important to keep in mind, in the United States, if you go back and read American political history in the 19th century, in the era around the Civil War, it may shock some of my American comrades, but we had a problem with corruption. We had Tammany Hall. In fact, if you look at municipal history in the U.S., the political machine was the norm, whether it was in New York or it was in Omaha, Nebraska, or Chicago, etc. The U.S. seriously began fighting corruption in about 1870. Guess what? We're still fighting it. Just a few months ago, the governor of Virginia, Robert McDonald, and his wife were convicted and will face prison time for corruption. So if we turn around and we say, gee, is Xi Jinping really serious in fighting it? And we then say, well, are we going to see victory in the war on corruption? I think not. The current war on corruption in China began in 1982. It has continued for over 3 decades at this point. I would expect it will continue for quite some time. It'll ebb, it'll flow. Sometimes it will be more overtly political, and sometimes it'll be more principled. But I will give Mr. Xi credit that he has responded, and I believe he's actually made some progress, although I don't think you can make as much as most people would like. And I will end there and turn over to Don.
Okay. Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming out this afternoon. Those of you maybe who are going away for Thanksgiving tomorrow will regret not having gone away today, but I hope not. Okay, so Robert's asked me to talk about the Fourth Plenum legal reforms and also their implications for U.S.-China relations. So I'm going to start off with the sort of very broad brush picture of the Fourth Plenum reforms and then talk at the end about their possible implications for U.S.-China relations, although don't hold your breath because I actually don't think there are a lot of implications. So the big picture summary of the Fourth Plenum reform decision is, I think, that it contemplates no fundamental reform in the basic relationship between the legal system on the one hand and sort of the party/government on the other hand. So it seems pretty clear to me that institutionally speaking, the party is going to remain above the law. At the same time, though, I think the decision does contemplate some genuinely meaningful and, in my opinion, positive reforms. And so, I don't think that it would be correct to look at the decision and say, oh, well, it is not advancing towards, some ideal we have of the rule of law, and therefore it's all meaningless. So there's a lot of meaningful stuff going on there, and much of it positive. So I guess, first of all, I just want to emphasize, though, that the decision still puts party first, law second, and it does this really literally. Every time the party and the law appear in the same sentence, the party always comes first. So, for example, Section 1 of the decision really starts off by saying several important principles that must be upheld in order to achieve the goal of ruling the state according to law. And the first one is leadership of the party. So that is, you'll notice, doesn't have any kind of substantive content to it. It's purely an institutional goal, which is the party must be in charge. Later on, the decision talks about what judges should be loyal to, and it lists 4 things: the party, the state, the people, and the law. And you'll notice which comes first and which comes last. Now, obviously, grammatically speaking, there's no particular reason why things at the front of a list get privileged over things at the end of a list in Chinese or in English. But nevertheless, we all know that in a document like this, nothing, not even a comma, is accidental. And so when we see the same pattern repeated over and over, I think we have to conclude that it's there for a reason. Some of you may have heard about the 3 Supremes, and I'm not referring to the music group, I'm referring to the Sangha Zhi Shang, the 3 Supreme things, a slogan long associated with the former president of the Supreme People's Court, Mr. Wang Shengjun. And these have been, we didn't hear about these for a while, and now they have been kind of resurrected in the 4th plenum decision. And the 3 Supremes are the 3 things that, again, courts should put at the forefront of their work. And again, the first priority is loyalty to the cause of the party. Second, interests of the people. And the third, the Constitution and the laws. And again, party comes first, laws come last. So in general, what we are presented with is an admonition to officials to obey the law. So certainly officials are told they should obey the law. They're not told that they're above the law, nothing like that. But nevertheless, one gets the feeling that this is really kind of an internal goal of the party talking to itself. It's saying, officials, you shouldn't have a mentality of special privileges. You should not hold yourself above the law. You should obey the law. But nevertheless, it's not proposing the institutional changes that would take that choice away from officials. Officials, in a sense, still have that choice about whether they want to obey the law or not. And again, one of the, I guess, key symptoms of that might be this system of shuangwei, this double designation system, which is the informal system, extra legal, we can call it, system of detention for officials such as Zhou Yongkang, who are being put under investigation, even though everybody in China, basically, the entire legal community, I won't say everybody, but most people who look at this institution in China would agree that it has no basis in law and really, legally speaking, has to be considered unlawful detention or perhaps kidnapping. So now, what about meaningful reforms? There are some meaningful major reforms, and I think the main one, which I think is really quite welcome, is the system calls for some significant reforms in the system for managing judges. So there were some vague words about protecting judicial tenure, but it's not clear what they will amount to until we see what goes on in practice. But much more concrete and more meaningful, I think, is a proposal to establish what is essentially a kind of career civil service model for the judiciary. Junior judges would be selected by provincial level courts and then would start their careers in basic level courts. And so you'll have, at the provincial level, essentially a kind of judicial bureaucracy that will be, looking at junior judges, assessing them, monitoring them, trying to pick out promising ones, skillful ones, and, gradually promoting them up higher and higher. The decision doesn't exactly say who will do the promoting, but I think it's pretty clear it's supposed to be in the hands of provincial courts. And this is a very significant reform because the model does not exist at the moment. The way things work now is courts are still basically slowly working their way out of the kind of Danwei model, the work unit model. So the main, or at least an important way at present to become a senior judge at a high-level court is to start out as a junior judge at the same high-level court, sort of the same way. And the classic story of business success, you start off at Consolidated Amalgamated in the mailroom, right, and then through hard work and gumption and appropriate scheming, you work your way up to the CEO's office. And so Chinese courts kind of work on that model. You start off low and you work your way up, and then the way to become, again, a senior judge at a high-level court is to start off as a junior judge at a high-level court. How do you get there? You go to a fancy law school and do well. But if you start off at a low-level court, then you're probably going to stay there. So there's not now a good system for identifying promising judges at lower levels and promoting them to different courts at higher levels, which, isn't necessarily a disaster. I mean, in the United States, there is no systematic way of identifying promising judges at lower levels and promoting them to higher levels. Countries like Japan and Germany do have civil service judiciaries like that. So at the same time, there's a bit of a problem because the decision endorses another good thing, which is to say we should have more a system whereby more senior and experienced people from outside the judiciary can move laterally into it. And they're looking at sort of the American model where you have kind of senior, experienced lawyers, for example, who at the peak of their careers will then get a federal appointment and move sideways into the federal judiciary. So there's a lot to be said for this idea, but the problem is that it contradicts the idea of having this kind of career civil service model where you start off as a junior person in the very lowest court and work your way up, because the whole point of having these sort of experienced, dignified people is that they're going to start off at a relatively high level. They're not going to want to start off at a low-level court out in the backwoods of Gansu somewhere, making 5,000 kwai a month. Okay. So there's some contradiction there that needs to be worked out. The decision also calls for some significant reforms in the court system. And both of these are apparently designed to address the problem of local protectionism. Courts at a given administrative level tend to be answerable to political authority at the same level, because their personnel appointments are controlled at that level and their funding is controlled at that level. So they are not subject to any meaningful control from superior courts. And again, that's different from, say, the system in Japan, where the Supreme Court, operates not only as a court of final appeal, but also as kind of a general administrative body. And so naturally, because of this system of local authority, courts tend to protect any party that local political authority wants to protect, for example, prominent local businesses. And the Chinese legal community has for a long time thought of this as a big problem and proposed various ways of addressing it. One proposal that came out of the fourth plenum decision is for the Supreme Court to establish what they call circuit tribunals with jurisdiction over several provinces. So at the moment, the top court is the Supreme People's Court, and immediately below that are provincial level courts. And so there's a proposal to establish some courts that will cover several provinces. Now, there is a misconception about this, though, which is that these are similar sort of to American circuit courts, that is, that they would be a level of court below the Supreme Court and above the existing courts. And that's not what's contemplated. In fact, they don't even use the word court, fa yuan. They use the word tribunal, fa ting, which tells you that that is really going to be a branch of the Supreme People's Court, and therefore any decision of those courts is going to be a decision of the Supreme Court and not of sort of a lower level court. Then there's another slightly different proposal, which is to establish another layer of courts, a fifth layer that would cross jurisdictional boundaries, and then we'll try cases that are cross-jurisdictional. So it's important to keep these two different reforms straight. Now, one thing that's very interesting about the communique is again, and I'm sorry to say that one of the things it doesn't say, but I'm not going to talk only about what it doesn't say. Just this thing in particular is very interesting that it doesn't talk about. And that is a proposal that was mooted at the third plenum to centralize court appointments and financing up to the provincial level, not beyond, but at least up to the provincial level, so that within any given province, it would be at the provincial level that decisions about appointments, so personnel and finances were made. And again, this was very explicitly with the idea of reducing the problem of local protectionism. So, you know, if it happened at the provincial level, of course, it's not going to get rid of it. But, you know, I think a lot of the local protectionism takes place at the local level, not at the provincial level. So there was this proposal for it to happen. There was some experimentation in Shanghai about putting this into practice, and not a peep about this proposal in the fourth plenum decision. So it's hard to know why. The reform is very popular among legal academics, but I'm told not so popular among judges. One reason is apparently that judges fear that a more kind of hierarchical system of authority in general will increase the power of the court leaders over them. And maybe now they feel that their individual power is enhanced by being able to move sideways, and they have some sideways connections, and therefore they can kind of sometimes talk back to the leadership of the court. I'm not sure about that. The other thing which rings much more, seems much more plausible, is that judges in prosperous areas fear that putting court finances under a higher administrative authority would mean a kind of leveling out. So a unified salary scale for all judges within a given province is going to mean either, you know, raising the salaries of judges in poor areas or lowering the salaries of judges in rich areas, and they're afraid it's going to mean lowering the salaries of judges in rich areas. So certainly odd that this reform seems to have stalled, and that's odd and kind of unfortunate. Finally, the decision denounces attempts by leading officials to interfere with court cases. This is again a big problem, and calls for the establishment of a system for keeping track of such attempts. Now, I think this is a meaningful reform in ambition, but not so much in implementation, because they haven't changed the system of incentives for judges. And so the same system of incentives for judges that makes them responsive to these attempts by officials to interfere is going to make them reluctant to report, you know, on these attempts to interfere, to record them in the big book, you know, black book of interference attempts, and then pass them on. So without a change in the system of incentives facing judges, it's hard to see how any traction will be achieved on this reform. The same decision elsewhere stresses the importance of the political legal committee, you know, the 政法委员会, and that is a party body that exists at all levels of the party, and that supervises all basically the organs of the people's democratic dictatorship. So the courts, the police, the procuracy, and I guess the justice bureaus. They regulate lawyers as well. It calls for party organization in all political legal bodies, that includes courts, to report important local matters to the local party committee. So on the one hand, you're saying let's enhance party control over courts, let's enhance the control of the political legal committee over courts, and on the other hand, you're saying let's minimize interference by officials in the operations of courts. Okay, there's a kind of a contradiction there, and it's not clear how that's going to be resolved. Certainly, one would have to be incredibly naive to think that Bo Xilai's case was decided solely by the judges who presided at the trial, or that Zhou Yongkang's case, you know, nobody in the standing committee of the Politburo is touching that. No, they're going to let it all be handled by the judges strictly in accordance with the evidence presented at trial. I just don't believe that's going to happen, and so one has to doubt the sort of sincerity of those moves. Okay. There's a couple of minor reforms, but I think I'll skip over them just for purposes of time here and talk a little bit about you know, implications for U.S.-China relations. And so the way to think about this is to think, what are some of the irritants in U.S.-China relations that are related to the legal system and might be affected by legal reforms? Well, first of all, intellectual property protection. The fourth plenum reforms show an effort, even if imperfectly realized, to professionalize the courts and to reduce the influence of local power holders in their operations. I should say another thing that does not appear in the fourth plenum report is a lot of kind of populist language that has appeared recently in discussions about the legal system. Criticisms of judges for being too professional, for applying the law to kind of mechanically, things like that. And again, a little bit mysteriously, that language is not in the fourth plenum document. And so I think perhaps in some way is perhaps a repudiation of a recent turn to populism and maybe a return towards a valuing of professionalization in courts, which I think is probably a good thing. So I think this reduction in local protectionism and increased professionalization has got to be good in general for intellectual property protection, since in many cases, the violators are enterprises with influence at the local level, but not necessarily at higher levels. So you've got a particular, factory producing pirated DVDs. Okay, they're, employing local people and paying taxes to the local officials and perhaps bribing the local officials, but that's not going all the way up to the provincial level. That's just at some small town level. And so if you move control over courts upwards, then I think it's much more possible for people to move against intellectual property violators. So, obviously none of this is going to make a difference if IP infringement rises to the level of a formal state policy in some area, but that's not all cases of IP infringement are of that kind. There have been some complaints about selective enforcement of anti-monopoly and other laws against U.S. and other foreign businesses recently. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce recently issued quite a detailed report on this, talking particularly about the acts of the National Development and Reform Commission, who seems to be the main target. So I had a long summary here, but I don't have time, obviously, to go into it at this point. But I guess I would just say that there's not much in the fourth plenum decision that would address this problem, because the problem of selective enforcement, and perhaps enforcement isn't really even the right word, since many times these companies are being told, don't call your lawyers. So they're not really interested in a legal analysis. It's more the sort of Southern sheriff approach. Well, how much do you got, son? Not much in the fourth plenum addressing this problem, because the fourth plenum isn't really about enforcement of law through administrative agencies. A lot of it is the measures they're talking about for legal system reform center on the court system, and not so much about kind of the everyday actions of administrative agencies in enforcing law. Another area of irritation is extradition of officials charged with corruption, who fled to the U.S. And China says, why would you want these people? Why don't you give them back to us? Why does the U.S. want them? They don't. Canada, the Canadian government tried for a long time to get rid of Lai Chang-shing, get him back to China, and Canadian courts stood in the way for a long time. So many times, we have, different branches of government. We have genuine separation of powers, and so even the executive can't always do what it wants to do. The problem here, of course, is that China and the U.S. don't have an extradition treaty, are unlikely ever to have an extradition treaty, and it's highly unlikely that anyone will be extradited without a treaty. Some of the problems are, will the U.S. justice system feel that the defendant will be granted adequate due process in China? And in addition, you have the problem of the UN Torture Convention, which forbids signatory members from extraditing anybody to a place where there is, I believe the language is, substantial grounds for believing that there is a danger that they will be tortured. And this is, this is a problem in the Chinese legal system. Official Chinese sources have themselves characterized torture as widespread, deeply entrenched, a stubborn illness, a malignant tumor. I mean, there's all sorts of language like this. There's a recent report by the special reporter for the UN Commission on Human Rights, Manfred Nowak, who looked at this issue. So there's some serious problems there, and it makes it very difficult to extradite people. Nothing in the fourth plenum reform agenda that addresses the problem of torture by police. And so I don't see any prospects for a reduction in tensions in that area. Finally, I would say, just to conclude with a look at human rights in general, again, I don't see much in the way of prospects for improvement in this area in the fourth plenum decision. I mean, there may be things happening outside the fourth plenum decision, but not in the fourth plenum decision. We do have proposals to make the judiciary more professional, less subject to the influence of local power holders, and those are all good things. but I don't think they really have much in the way of implications for on the issue of human rights. And the fourth plenum decision still makes quite clear that the primary loyalty, judges, is to the party. So I'll stop there, and let's have
Thank you.
questions.
Two questions first before we open it up to if you have questions for each other, for the audience. Having had these discussions with both American and Chinese critics now for about 30 years, many Chinese friends and some American historians I've spoken to said that some of the things that we criticize Chinese officials for being corrupt about, our officials or our elites also gain, but they do it through ways that are now legalized, through mechanisms that their children can go to top schools because they are legacies. They have ways of protecting their wealth. That part of the story of going from the age of Boss Tweed to the current day has been elites finding legal mechanisms for protecting theirs. And when the Chinese seek to do the same thing, they can be accused of being corrupt. And I was thinking of that critique in light of something that Jeremy Barmé wrote recently. He said that in the anti-corruption campaign, Xi Jinping has not yet gone after any Hung Erdai or Guan Erdai, either the second generation of the original Red founders of China or the leading officials from the early stages of the People's Republic. Do we see, in tandem with the anti-corruption campaign or in connection with these legal reforms, do you see any ways that the group of families of which Xi Jinping is a representative are actually protecting or legalizing any of their perquisites? Is there any process of that sort ongoing from either the corruption or the legal angle?
Good question. Why don't you start while I'm thinking?
So I just blindly jump off. Actually, I think when you look at China more generally, looking beyond the current anti-corruption campaign, China faces a real challenge in that a generation ago, there was no wealthy class in China. One of the byproducts of rapid economic development and the fact that the Chinese economy is either as big or is bigger than the American economy is, there's a whole new strata of wealthy Chinese, many of whom are linked through blood or marriage to the political elite. Now, for the popular response is to assume that the princelings all got there through nefarious ways of wire pulling and inside connections, etc. Well, maybe I'm a cynic, but we got a whole strata of those in the United States as well. And no criticism of Chelsea Clinton per se, but I'm pretty sure when she got a job at a hedge fund, it wasn't 3 weeks into the job that someone said, "Your dad's who?" You know, we have the similar situation where the sons and daughters of elites, as Robert alleges, they have advantages getting into top schools. They're often very bright. They often work hard. And for us, this is normal. They go to Wall Street. They become investment bankers, etc. For China, this is all new. And I think the more general thing that China needs to be sorting out is not only the problem of corruption, but also the relationship between power and wealth. They're not separate. They're not separate in most economies. And yet in China, the merger is messier. The separation is more imperfect. And now I hope Don has a good legal answer to the question that I'm trying to struggle with on the fly.
No, I don't have that's an excellent question, and it's worth thinking about. Is there some way that the kind of second generation has figured out to entrench their privileges in a in a not so obvious way? But so I don't have a good answer for that. But I do want to sort of address an earlier point of yours, which I think is quite it's a good point that I think if we look at any society, we will find that somehow the rich and powerful find ways to transmit their wealth and power to their offspring. So I think if one looks at Chinese corruption as a way of saying, as a way of answering the question, is China uniquely bad? Then, that's silly, right? Because that shouldn't be the question. I think it's the issue when I look at corruption, say from a legal standpoint, is what is the government doing about it? What is the government allowing other people to do about it? So, for example, if you think about the corruption in the United States in Tammany Hall, so who was it that exposed Tammany Hall? Was it a top-down anti-corruption effort by the government? No, it was muckraking newspapers. So one has to ask whether those institutions, are allowed to exist such that Chinese people could make their own informed decision about what kind of privileges do they think are okay and what kind of privileges do they not think are okay.
I just add one other thought is paradoxically the people who have a real vested interest in creating legal protections for property rights might well be the Hong Ar Dai, because they don't want to be subject to arbitrary confiscation just because their father or mother on the political side has gotten into trouble. So if you look at pressure for property reform, it might well come from the top down in a strange backward manner.
Second question, Don, you mentioned human rights concerns, and I was struck in listening to Andy's presentation that in general it seems to me that when Americans hear about the cases of dissidents in China, about human rights questions, when we hear about what happens to Liu Xiaobo or Ai Weiwei or any number of other dissidents who get locked up, and we hear the legal or quasi-legalistic claims of the officials that they did this following thing. Ilham Tohti was provoking sedition. And then these people go into a sort of a non-legal, disappeared status. Well, we say this is horrible, this is clearly false, why aren't they getting due process? But when the same legal order can say that somebody has a gold statue of Mao or several tons of renminbi, we say, oh wow, that's pretty bad, he's clearly corrupt, and we seem to be more inclined to take those claims at face value. And then these people are subsequently sort of disappeared through a shuanghui or some extra legal system. Do we have is there any kind of double standard at work, or what criteria should we look for when we're judging the claims about evidence or guilt or innocence that come out of the Chinese government in these various cases? Because we seem to look differently at claims about corruption and the kinds of claims that get leveled at dissidents in human rights cases. Okay,
well, good question, and I would just like to point out that before you had said that, I had already blown the whistle on shuanghui, this double designation system as legalized kidnap. Well, actually, unlawful detention under Chinese law.
Indeed,
and extremely problematic. And that is what is used against, allegedly corrupt officials. But it's a huge problem because, of course, not everybody allegedly corrupt is actually corrupt. And the people who run the internal party disciplinary system are not necessarily, well trained in investigative techniques. They don't know how to, trace, trails of assets from clever people who've been hiding them, and so you resort to the next best thing, which is, the rubber hose. And so I think that accounts for a lot of the maltreatment that takes place within the shuanghui system. But in terms of how to look at things, I think that, it's, sometimes we can have an idea about the substance of the charges, whether they make sense or not, whether they really exist. Do we, is it fair to just, for example, one of the current charges against Pu Zhiqiang, the lawyer, is, which is stirring up trouble and provoking disturbances, right? And actually that's not as vague as it sounds, because that's just the name of a crime, but when you look at the criminal law, there's actually some conditions that have to be met, and there's a Supreme People's Court document which makes it even more precise what conditions have to be met to commit this crime. So in fact, the government can't just say, oh, you're just stirring up trouble. They have to say, you did A, B, or C, and it's really impossible under the facts as we know them to find that Pu Zhiqiang did any of, A, B, or C, because it lists some very specific things that have to be met. So, but, very often we're not necessarily going to know those facts. But I think then at that point we can look at procedure. So, for example, has the government, made the trial open? Stirring up trouble and provoking disturbances, there's no state secrets involved in that. The Supreme Court, People's Court, has been saying, and Chinese law has been saying since 1979, the court organization law says that all trials should be open. But everybody knows you can't just walk into a Chinese court right? Even though trials are supposed to be open. So if trials that don't have any plausible reason to be closed are open, then that's reassuring. If people are genuinely allowed to be represented by the lawyer of their choice, which again is allowed under Chinese law. If witnesses are required to testify in court, which again is required under Chinese law, even though in criminal cases it basically never happens. So I think we could look at a way of kind of avoiding this issue of can we really know, right, to what extent are they guilty? We can look at this other question and say, well, if there's a good case, why can't the government follow its own procedural rules? I mean, I think one could ask at least that much. And with respect to corrupt officials as well. So, I mean, I think, people like Zhou Yongkang, right? He's just been disappeared. We haven't heard anything about him. I think Zhou Yongkang deserves, a fair process.
I tend to agree with Robert. There is a double standard being applied. I mean, when I read about a case my natural assumption is, of course, they're guilty. In fact, we should not assume that. And certainly the way that the process works, where you're basically detained by the party, and you are detained until such time as they decide you are ready to move on. Either you're ready to move on to your trial, or you're ready to remain in detention. And I know from reading some of the confessions, you get the impression that 6 months, 8 months, a year into indefinite detention, people are willing to confess to anything in order to get their case moved out of the party disciplinary system and into the court system. One of the patterns you see is people get to court and they want to repudiate their confession. And they say, I merely confessed in order to get to the court so I could deny my confession. And of course, what does the court turn around and do and say, well, no, we're not, you can't repudiate. So I think it is true that we do tend to assume, without too much question, that people detained by the party are guilty. In fact, if you look at the numbers, that isn't actually true. I gave you earlier the number of cases that were filed. There's an earlier stage in which the procuratorate accepts a case. They used to give us those numbers in the annual reports. They've stopped doing them for whatever reason, but in the old days, about half of those who were initially investigated never ended up with an indictment. What I assume and what I've been told is that a lot of those people end up getting an administrative punishment, a warning, a demerit, a demotion, etc., because it's determined they haven't really committed a major offense. And what we don't know within that block is how many of those people actually get off because the procuratorate determines that they actually aren't guilty of anything. It's a wide open guess, but I think you're absolutely right. When it hits the discipline inspection website and it's announced so-and-so is under investigation for serious disciplinary violations by the GWA, my natural assumption is, oh, well, they're obviously guilty. But, it's a reflex that I suppose we probably need to avoid.
Of course, the most important question in the study of Chinese law is when will we have a better word than procuratorate, which is almost impossible to say in English.
Procuracy.
Procuracy would be better.
You can cut 2 syllables off it.
No, we stick with procuratorate.
Okay.
The harder it is to pronounce, the more we keep the unwashed out.
Well, why don't we open it up, please? We have microphones, and if you just raise a hand, we'll be happy to pass one of them your way. Yes, back.
Thank you. Thank you, professors. Fascinating. I have 2 questions, one for Professor Wiedemann and a very naive one for Professor Clark. I'll start with the naive one because I just had to take the No Fear Act review for federal employees, and I'm wondering if there's any kind of whistleblower protection within the legal system or within any kind of parallel system. And if you don't mind, for Professor Wiedemann, just a short question. Are there any corruption prosecution hotspots? So is, Shanxi and Hubei generating more numbers even according to your official sources than other provinces, or is it fairly evenly distributed? Thank you.
I'm not aware of any formal law that provides protection for whistleblowers sort of within government agencies who expose wrongdoing, something like that.
It does appear that the campaign has fallen somewhat unevenly. the problem with trying to say where it's falling most heavily is you've got two choices. You can kind of do it as a kind of art, which is, you read the individual cases and you start guessing, well, my sense is it's hit pretty hard in Guangdong, it's hit hard in Shanxi and Jiangxi. Hubei looks like it's gotten a lot. Tianjin seems to have gotten off pretty easy. But that's just my impression of reading it. You really need to get the annual numbers from the that'll come out with the work reports, which will be filed in March. I haven't looked at the ones from 2013 at this point, but yeah, it's uneven. Exactly what explains the uneven pattern, I have not had a chance to really think about or to analyze.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Chen Weihua, China Daily. You talked about, it's both political and principled. So looking forward, do you think it's going to be more political or more principled? Because it seems to me that if you want to sustain the campaign, it has to be principled. Thank you. Oh, if I can ask just, Robert just mentioned, the Chinese looking at sort of the K Street, former officials, lobbying for influence. That was like, corruption after retirement, why many Chinese officials corrupt, before they retire, obviously. Thank you.
It's a timing issue.
I agree with you that to sustain the anti-corruption drive over a long period of time, the principle has to take over from the political. At some point, the political side can be dangerous. It can generate a backlash. You can push things in directions that you might not want to go. My own view is this. The principal part is the bulk of it. You look at the Zhou Bo Xilai cases, they make up the most visible, the most exciting part of the campaign. The really boring campaign is the day in and day out trench warfare, war of attrition against mid and low-level corruption. That's been going on for a long time. Xi Jinping escalated that back in 2012. I think he'll continue to keep that up, but I would see at some point the political side would have to begin to fade somewhat. I think it'll never go away. You'll continue to have scandals crop up, et cetera. But the principled part, I think, in the end, is what carries you on year in and year out as you slowly move toward a less corrupt system.
Good. Down front and then right next, then Tony.
What do you think is the impact of all this corruption on the economy of the country, or is it insignificant?
It's not unmeasurable. The reality is, though, when you look at the Chinese economy and you look at the growth of corruption, over the 30 years that the Chinese have waged the war on corruption, China has also had the second largest gain in per capita income in the world. It is almost, it's well over double the number 3, which was South Korea. It's multiple times what we had. So, if you look at the Chinese economy, the pattern is worsening corruption and rising growth, hence the subtitle of my more recent book. Does that mean that growth has raised corruption? That corruption has raised growth? Absolutely not. It shaves something off. 100 million or 200 million renminbi sitting in someone's basement is not a profitable investment. How much is it shaved off, I think, is very hard to tell. But certainly it is. There's been a cost. And as the economy roared out at double-digit rates, you could absorb that cost. As the growth rate begins to fall, the drag of corruption necessarily increases. So you're at a point now where perhaps Jiang Zemin or even Hu Jintao could look at corruption and say, well, it's a problem, but it's not really killing us. I think now more and more Xi Jinping has to worry about it. You know, the economy drops, growth rates drop below 7%, and corruption's going to become a much bigger drag in relative terms. So, yeah, there's definitely been an impact.
Tony, and then we'll go to the back.
I just wanted to push the conversation about political versus principled a little further, because you haven't really defined what you mean by principle. And I'll just say, I guess, what I think, and then you can comment on it. But it seems to me that kind of at a more macro level, you've heard a lot about how the problem with corruption is that all these local officials do not really listen to what the party is trying to get them to do. So I see a campaign against corruption as being the principle being reestablishing central power over local power. That seems to me to be a lot of the driving force behind it. And on the legal side, I know legal scholars often don't like this discussion, but again, I hear it a lot lately about are these reforms about rule of law or rule by law?
Oh, yeah, there's no question that a big part of the anti-corruption, or a big part of the corruption problem is the protective umbrellas, the ability of officials at the local level to collude, the inability of Beijing to actually to work its will on the local level. That's a perennial fact of Chinese political history. I think, you know, the anti-corruption campaign seeks to break through that, but the anti-corruption campaign is continued to be structured along those very lines. You have not seen a centralization, you've not seen a move, although you have had these 3 or now 4 nationwide inspection campaigns where the center literally sends people out to bypass the local level, to go after local corruption. But they have done this before. When they went after Chen Liangyu in Shanghai, when they went after the Shaman case, they literally had to send hundreds of investigators down from Beijing because Beijing basically said you can't trust the locals. The locals will cover things up. If a sustained anti-corruption campaign means repeatedly having to send people out from Beijing to literally attack the local level, that's going to be hard to sustain. You really got to get a systematic solution which gets rid of this problem where you were talking about earlier, Don was talking about, where the local prosecutors answer to the local party officials. Well, if the party officials are corrupt, what are you going to do? Charge your boss with being corrupt? It's career suicide. And the other thing I think you need to be aware of is it's not like the Procuratorate or the Discipline Inspection Commission is corruption-free itself. And battling corruption within the anti-corruption institutions is a major challenge.
Yeah, Don.
Could I ask a question? I'm sort of springing this on you. So I don't know whether you've thought about this, but you probably have, which is that I guess the consensus among economists is that China's growth model, right, which up till now has been sort of driven by investment in things like industry and infrastructure, needs to change in order to be more sustainable, and it needs to change to something that's more service-oriented and more demand-driven. And so my question is, what is the relationship of corruption to the type of kind of growth model that China uses? Does changing the growth model, will that make corruption, in the way that it's carried out now, more difficult? And if so, does that mean that we will have less corruption, or does it mean we can expect major pushback against this reform from people who want to keep on dipping into the pot the same way they've been able to do it up till now?
Well, if you look at where corruption is concentrated, it's concentrated in things like real estate development. It's concentrated in the energy sector with mining concessions, oil field contracts, and so forth. It's concentrated, my sense is that a lot of it is concentrated in the state sector because in many areas the state sector has either a quasi-monopoly or oligopolistic power. If you move and actually marketize the economy and you actually deconcentrate those pools of power areas where you can use political and administrative power to manipulate the result, yeah, that should do it. I mean, when I looked at corruption in the book, my assumption was, or the argument was, that a lot of the corruption that we saw in the 1990s, early 2000s, was basically a fight over windfall profits and rents. Well, the model basically suggests you should see the eventual dissipation of rents. When you've got a piece of real estate, the first time it moves from the state to the market, there are tremendous windfall profits to be made, but in theory, once it's on the market, then market forces take over and the opportunities for excess profits should disappear. That hasn't happened. And the reason it hasn't happened is that the shift from a investment directed growth model hasn't been complete. Is Xi Jinping going to push that? That was what he was talking about at the third plenum. I don't know how much progress we've made on that. I think you're right. There will be pushback. People do not willingly give away ill-gotten gains. People will fight to keep them. So yeah, I think, if you did really see this new model, you definitely would. You should see, I should say, you should see reductions in corruption.
Don, I wonder if I could bring Tony's question back to you, because it seems that if it is going to be a principled, not even a campaign, just a state of affairs, if it's going to be more principled and less political, then you have to have an explicit theory of how things got this bad in the first place and where corruption comes from. And the answer to date seems to be that, well, people are bad, or is it a story about more virtuous, less corrupt central authorities having to rein in the locals? Or do you see in the fourth plenum documents a real attempt to look at the system itself and to ask what has it been in the system, what deficiencies allowed corruption? Are we seeing the beginnings of a real systematic approach to corruption that can be sustained, that can be principled?
I don't see that in the fourth plenum decision, no, because I don't even recall them talking that much about corruption. There has recently been a proposal to have a sort of special unit set up, and this would be a governmental unit within the procuracy, not a party disciplinary unit, and it would be headed by someone with the rank, I guess, of vice, president of the procuracy. So a high-level official, and maybe it's some kind of attempt to construct something like, Hong Kong's Independent Commission Against Corruption or something like that. But there's, I don't see anything more than that. In other words, they're saying, let's try to get a state body that will investigate corruption that has a relatively, high-level official in charge, and so therefore we'll be able to overcome some of the obstacles. But that doesn't kind of change the basic nature of the system. It just says, let's get it's like, I guess, if you were to worry about why poor people don't have enough food, you just make them richer rather than, so you make poor people not poor rather than changing the basic structure of society somehow so that you have free food distribution depots everywhere, something like that. Maybe that's a bad metaphor, but the point is it doesn't propose to change the system as a whole. It just proposes to make some tweaks within it. So I don't see any fundamental changes like that coming out of the fourth plenum decision.
Looking at the way cases are presented, I think the thinking within the Chinese system is it's bad people. Yeah. Because the tendency is, first of all, you get a set of charges which are basically about corruption. But then next you get the moral degeneracy, the multiple mistresses, so on and so forth, where what they're doing is they're saying this person was just not taking advantage of their authority, or the fact that the system gave them the ability to extract money either in the forms of bribes or embezzlement, rents, etc. But they were fundamentally morally degenerate. And when I read that narrative, the narrative that comes out of it is the system is good, the individual is bad. To me, that sounds a lot like denial.
And you see this with dissidents as well. It's not just that they were stirring up trouble, it's that they also had mistresses or they liked pornography. We see this in both cases. We have a question right in the middle at the back, and then over to you at the side, and then Ryan. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so maybe over to the side, and then Ryan on.
just the cooperation between China and the U.S. on the fight against corruption. How long do we need to wait to see some real progress on this aspect? Thank you.
I find the question a little vague. Could you identify, for example, the barriers that you're waiting to go away?
Yeah, just some officials from China that travel to the U.S.
Yeah.
How many years? I mean, maybe in the next year, can we see some flies and the tigers from the China, be sent back to China?
Okay, so the problem with that is this is what I talked about earlier on. I don't think there's any immediate prospect of any progress on that because, again, that gets into extradition issues. There's not an extradition treaty between China and the U.S., and I don't think there's much of a prospect of there being an extradition treaty between China and the U.S. because for that kind of thing, both countries have to have a kind of fundamental faith in the other country's legal system, and I don't think that fundamental faith, bilateral faith exists. For example, China doesn't enforce U.S. judgments, the U.S. doesn't enforce Chinese judgments, so I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I think there has to be much greater degree of convergence between the two legal systems, and I don't see that happening soon. I mean, and it's not because the U.S. likes corrupt officials. It's just some fundamental disconnect between the way the two legal systems work. Again, I just use the example of Canada. The Canadian government wanted to send back Lai Chang-shing. I mean, they were in Canadian court arguing, get rid of this guy. We do not want this guy in our country. But he had gotten in, and the Canadian courts wouldn't make him leave, because they had other concerns. They're not concerned about foreign policy issues. They're not concerned about whether we want people who bribe officials to be in our own country, perhaps bribing our own officials. They have other concerns.
Ryan, and then over to this side.
Thanks very much. I actually have a question for each of you gentlemen. Professor Clark, constitutionalism obviously popped up in the fourth plenum decision document. This was after a couple of years of constitutionalism kind of sort of being a dirty word on the Chinese side, and accusations of the idea of sticking to a constitution being a Western imported concept. So I'm curious for your thoughts on what inclusion of the term constitutionalism alongside rule of law means in the context of the fourth plenum and what this might mean going forward. And for Professor Wiedemann, the question I've got is, in all of the mentions of different locations where we've seen corruption cases, the one place that I haven't heard much about is Shanghai. And certainly have heard rumors off and on that Shanghai is going to be next, Shanghai is going to be next. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on, why we haven't necessarily seen any activity in Shanghai and sort of think about the political versus the practical, if there's any analysis there.
Okay, so I guess I'm going to have to disagree with your premise because I don't think constitutionalism does appear in the fourth plenum document. I mean, xianzheng is the term. So they do talk about the Constitution, but and they have always talked about the Constitution and the need for people, everybody in the country to obey the Constitution, and also for the party to act according to the Constitution. But constitutionalism, that as translated into Chinese, xianzheng still remains, a forbidden term, and I don't believe it does appear in the document.
But xianzheng, in many, many ways, certainly is there. They're going to be swearing oaths to uphold xianzheng. They talk a lot about the relationship between xianzheng and, yifà zhiguo, right?
Well,
xianzheng zhuyi, xianzheng minzhu doesn't have, but
no, but just those two words together, xianzheng. I deny that they. I mean, I could be wrong, but my recollection, and people have looked at this. If you do a word search, you will not find the term xianzheng.
How about shenfa?
Yeah, yes, of course you find constitution, but xianzheng, this constitutionalism, has a particular meaning, and that meaning is not welcome. Because it is understood by both promoters and detractors to mean things like accountable government, elections, et cetera, et cetera.
But would you not agree that the shenfa then is
yes,
quite prominent?
Oh, they talk about the Constitution, absolutely. But I just mean to say it's very important it's very important to see that they do not accept the term, constitutionalism.
Right.
Now, we could talk about the irony of a party that, it proclaims itself to be a Marxist party, talking about how terrible Western ideas are, but I wouldn't. Let's not talk about that irony. Okay.
Andy, and then I think if we have short questions and short answers, we'll have time after Andy's got a question for you too. Short questions, short answers. We'll have time. But first, Andy too.
It's very hard to explain why something hasn't happened. There's been a lot of speculation. I think a lot of that speculation comes out of those who believe that the ultimate goal of Xi Jinping's campaign is Jiang Zemin, and therefore Jiang Zemin's power base in Shanghai. I don't have an easy answer because I don't know if Shanghai simply is avoiding the blow or if its turn has not yet come. So I don't have a good answer for your question.
Okay, we have quick questions and quick answers. Yes.
This question about the political aspect of the campaign. Both Bachelet and Khan, they are the left wing, and seems that Xi Jinping did not targeting the right wing rivals, such as someone from Feng Jiabao's faction. Why he actually himself is a pro-left? Why he target the left rival, not the right rival? Is there any other reason, political reason?
You can't take on all fronts at once. You got to pick your fights, and you got to take on those who are your more immediate enemies, while building united fronts with those who you might want to go after later. I'm not surprised he's concentrated on the left. I think that was the more immediate threat to him.
Okay, and then one last question.
Yeah, I guess my question is kind of in line with the previous one. I mean, the phraseology issues in the communique. I mean, one of the key terms come up in the communique is the rule of law under the Communist Party's leadership. Mm-hmm. So I need some political science or legal interpretation of that phrase. What does that exactly entails, or to how large extent is comparable to it sounds to me quite similar to a constitutional monarchy or something like that. So yeah, just some phraseology interpretations there.
Okay, well, I think the distinction between rule of law under the party and constitutional monarchy is that in a constitutional monarchy, the monarch is under the Constitution. So constitutional modifies monarchy, whereas in rule of law under the party modifies rule of law, if we were to look at it grammatically. So the rule of law under the party, so the law, I don't want to like make word plays or something, but what I mean to say is that, as I think made clear, and not just by words, but also by the actions of the party, it is not their intention to themselves, be, governed in a sense by law. Now, I don't want to be unrealistic. I mean, humans run society, and so there is no society which can be really run mechanistically, by the law with no human intervention. Obviously, we have humans everywhere, but I think there is a difference between, political regimes in which, the government feels somehow meaningfully constrained by external rules and systems in which it does not. And I don't think, I think we could look, for example, at the distinction between, when, the need to have, say, a legal advisor in the White House, who writes legal opinions coming up justifying the acts of the White House. And, when the president wants to do something, the president has to think, well, how will this fly? And they have to come up with they believe that they have to come up with some plausible legal argument. They can't just say, oh, I'm just going to do it. And I really don't think Xi Jinping thinks that way. I don't think that in the Standing Committee of the Politburo, when they're deciding, what to do with, Gao Zhisheng or something, whether somebody's saying, well, is this legal? We better talk to this law professor, and get an opinion on it. And because nobody's discussing it. That's not part of the discourse. It doesn't need to be defended in terms of whether it's legal or not. Even if we can say, sometimes say, the legal opinions of people in the White House, we may think they're disingenuous and they're forced and they're not very convincing. But nevertheless, there's a certain discourse and a certain procedure that people acknowledge the legitimacy of. And I just don't see that going on at all in Zhongnanhai. And I don't see any ambition to have that go on in
Well, thank you, Professor Wiedemann, Professor Clark. Thanks to all of you for coming. On December 4th, we will have our second annual U.S.-China Relations Year in Review, a look back at the past year with both Chinese and American analysts. And then on December 12th, we will have Zhao Yong, who's the author of Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Dragon? Why China Has the Best and Worst Educational System in the World. as well as Karen Fisher from the Chronicle on Higher Education, and we'll be looking at issues in United States and Chinese educational systems and the way that we are increasingly influencing and learning from one another. We hope you will join us for those programs as well. Thank you and happy Thanksgiving. Usually succinct questions. Usually you get echo lectures. Yeah. That was good. Thank you.